Hello everyone, before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's dive into today's story. Mark Davis, a 23-year-old law student, walked through the rain-soaked streets of a small college town in Texas, his mind heavy with thoughts of mounting debt and looming deadlines. With only a few weeks left before graduation, Mark's life seemed to be spiraling out of control. His father's passing had left him with debts he could barely keep up with, and the weight of it all was starting to crush him. As he reached his apartment, the cold wind stung his face, a stark contrast to the warmth of the memories of his family. He pulled out his phone and saw a message he had been dreading, a final notice from the landlord. The rent was overdue, and Mark didn't have the money to pay it. Then, his phone buzzed again. It was a call he hadn't expected, from a woman he had never met, Eleanor Brooks. She was a name he had heard of, but never imagined he'd have a reason to speak to. Eleanor was a 71-year-old millionaire businesswoman, known for her wealth and sharp business acumen. Mark couldn't imagine what she would want with him. The phone rang a third time. Hesitant, he answered. "Mr. Davis, this is Eleanor Brooks. I'd like to meet with you. It's about your financial situation." Mark frowned, confusion clouding his thoughts. "I'm sorry, who are you?" "I know enough," she replied smoothly. "Meet me at Brooks Bistro, 7 p.m. It's important." The call ended abruptly, leaving Mark staring at the screen, speechless. It was strange, but something about the urgency in her voice felt important. He glanced at the clock. He didn't have much time. At 7 p.m. sharp, Mark arrived at the bistro. The rain had let up, but the streets were still slick with moisture. He pushed open the door to the warm, inviting atmosphere of the restaurant. There, sitting at a corner table, was Eleanor Brooks, her silver hair perfectly styled, her tailored suit a sharp contrast to his worn-out jacket. "Mr. Davis," she said, not looking up from her drink, "please, have a seat." Mark hesitated for a moment, still unsure of what was happening. As he sat down across from her, she studied him quietly, as if weighing his every move. "I know your father left you with a lot of debt," she said, cutting straight to the point. "And I also know that you are struggling to make ends meet. I have a proposition for you. Marry me." Mark blinked, unsure if he had heard her correctly. "What?" he asked, his voice betraying his disbelief. She leaned forward, her voice calm but firm. "I know this sounds crazy, but hear me out. I'm offering you a business arrangement, not a romantic relationship. In exchange for your name on my arm, I'll take care of your debts, ensure your financial future, and you will have the opportunity to live a life of comfort. All I ask in return is your loyalty and your silence. I don't want to be bothered with emotions, just a companion by my side to help secure my legacy." Mark's mind raced as he processed her words. He had never heard of such an offer before. A marriage for convenience, but one that could solve all his problems. He was tempted, but something didn't sit right with him. "Why me?" he asked, his voice cautious. Eleanor smiled softly. "You're young, unattached, and in desperate need of help. You have nothing to lose, and I have everything to offer. Think of it as a business transaction. A mutually beneficial agreement." Mark sat back in his chair, his heart racing as he considered her offer. He had always prided himself on his independence, but at that moment, he realized just how dire his situation had become. He had no choice. "Okay," he said slowly. "I'll do it." Eleanor's smile widened. "Good. The arrangements will be made immediately." And just like that, Mark's life was about to change forever. Hello everyone, before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's dive into today's story. Mark Davis, a 23-year-old law student, walked through the rain-soaked streets of a small college town in Texas, his mind heavy with thoughts of mounting debt and looming deadlines. With only a few weeks left before graduation, Mark's life seemed to be spiraling out of control. His father's passing had left him with debts he could barely keep up with, and the weight of it all was starting to crush him. As he reached his apartment, the cold wind stung his face, a stark contrast to the warmth of the memories of his family. He pulled out his phone and saw a message he had been dreading, a final notice from the landlord. The rent was overdue, and Mark didn't have the money to pay it. Then, his phone buzzed again. It was a call he hadn't expected, from a woman he had never met, Eleanor Brooks. She was a name he had heard of, but never imagined he'd have a reason to speak to. Eleanor was a 71-year-old millionaire businesswoman, known for her wealth and sharp business acumen. Mark couldn't imagine what she would want with him. The phone rang a third time. Hesitant, he answered. "Mr. Davis, this is Eleanor Brooks. I'd like to meet with you. It's about your financial situation." Mark frowned, confusion clouding his thoughts. "I'm sorry, who are you?" "I know enough," she replied smoothly. "Meet me at Brooks Bistro, 7 p.m. It's important." The call ended abruptly, leaving Mark staring at the screen, speechless. It was strange, but something about the urgency in her voice felt important. He glanced at the clock. He didn't have much time. At 7 p.m. sharp, Mark arrived at the bistro. The rain had let up, but the streets were still slick with moisture. He pushed open the door to the warm, inviting atmosphere of the restaurant. There, sitting at a corner table, was Eleanor Brooks, her silver hair perfectly styled, her tailored suit a sharp contrast to his worn-out jacket. "Mr. Davis," she said, not looking up from her drink. "Please, have a seat." Mark hesitated for a moment, still unsure of what was happening. As he sat down across from her, she studied him quietly, as if weighing his every move. "I know your father left you with a lot of debt," she said, cutting straight to the point. "And I also know that you are struggling to make ends meet. I have a proposition for you. Marry me." Mark blinked, unsure if he had heard her correctly. "What?" he asked, his voice betraying his disbelief. She leaned forward, her voice calm but firm. "I know this sounds crazy, but hear me out. I'm offering you a business arrangement, not a romantic relationship. In exchange for your name on my arm, I'll take care of your debts, ensure your financial future, and you will have the opportunity to live a life of comfort. All I ask in return is your loyalty and your silence. I don't want to be bothered with emotions, just a companion by my side to help secure my legacy." Mark's mind raced as he processed her words. He had never heard of such an offer before. A marriage for convenience, but one that could solve all his problems. He was tempted, but something didn't sit right with him. "Why me?" he asked, his voice cautious. Eleanor smiled softly. "You're young, unattached, and in desperate need of help. You have nothing to lose, and I have everything to offer. Think of it as a business transaction. A mutually beneficial agreement." Mark sat back in his chair, his heart racing as he considered her offer. He had always prided himself on his independence, but at that moment, he realized just how dire his situation had become. He had no choice. "Okay," he said slowly. "I'll do it." Eleanor's smile widened. "Good. The arrangements will be made immediately." And just like that, Mark's life was about to change forever. The days following the meeting with Eleanor felt like a blur to Mark. The deal was struck, the papers were signed, and now, he was officially married, though not in the traditional sense. The ring on his finger, a symbol of a contract rather than love, felt cold, almost like a weight he couldn't shake. He was now bound to a woman he hardly knew, a millionaire businesswoman who had offered him a way out of his financial mess, but at what cost? He had spent the last few days adjusting to the bizarre reality of being Eleanor's husband, or rather, her companion, for a lack of better words. Their marriage was not about romance, it was an arrangement, a business deal. The luxury of Eleanor's world was overwhelming, and at times, it felt like Mark was playing a role he wasn't entirely prepared for. Eleanor's mansion was nothing like the small apartment he had lived in just days ago. The grandeur of the house, with its towering columns, polished marble floors, and expensive artwork, made him feel like a stranger in his own life. The staff were efficient but distant, treating him as if he belonged, but he knew better. He didn't belong here. He was still Mark Davis, a law student drowning in debt. As days passed, Mark began to adjust to the rules of this new life. Eleanor didn't ask for much. She was a woman of few words, and their interactions were polite but formal. They dined together, attended charity events, and even traveled for business, but it was clear this was not a marriage in any traditional sense. There was no passion, no affection, just two people sharing a life for reasons that had nothing to do with love. It wasn't until one evening, as they sat at a gala for one of Eleanor's many business ventures, that Mark started to see things differently. The lights were dimmed, the orchestra played softly in the background, and the room was filled with the hum of laughter and quiet conversations. Mark stood off to the side, his hands clenched behind his back, watching Eleanor mingle with the guests, her elegance undeniable. He couldn't help but notice the subtle power she exuded, how everyone in the room gravitated toward her. She was a woman who had built an empire, and yet here she was, asking him to be her partner, not out of love, but out of convenience. As the night went on, Eleanor caught his gaze from across the room, her eyes briefly meeting his before she excused herself from her conversation and made her way toward him. She was flawless as always, her evening dress flowing effortlessly, her presence commanding attention with every step she took. "Are you enjoying yourself?" she asked, her voice calm and composed. Mark nodded, though the truth was, he felt out of place. "It's all a little overwhelming." Eleanor studied him for a moment, then smiled softly, a rare moment of vulnerability flickering across her features. "I know this isn't easy, Mark. But you're doing well. You've adapted quickly." He didn't respond at first, but something inside him stirred a mixture of admiration and confusion. Was it possible that Eleanor saw him as more than just a placeholder in her life? Or was this all simply part of the deal? He couldn't tell. The gala continued around them, but Mark's thoughts were elsewhere. He had begun to wonder, was there a chance for something more between them, or was he truly just here to fulfill his part of the contract? Later that night, when they returned to the mansion, Eleanor was quiet as they walked through the grand hallway. Mark had gotten used to the silence between them, but tonight, it felt different. The tension in the air was palpable. As they reached the stairs, Eleanor paused and turned to him. "Mark, I need to be clear about something," she said, her tone serious. "This arrangement we have, it's just that. A business deal. There are no expectations beyond that. I don't want you to think that I'm asking for anything more." Mark swallowed, nodding slowly. "I understand." But as she turned to leave, something inside him couldn't ignore the lingering question, what if Eleanor wanted something more? What if, deep down, there was a part of her that longed for the connection he was starting to feel too? The days that followed were filled with the same routine: formal dinners, business meetings, and quiet evenings spent alone. But as the weeks went by, Mark found himself growing more conflicted. He had come into this arrangement with a clear purpose: to get his life back on track, to solve his financial problems, and to escape the suffocating weight of debt. But now, things were starting to shift. He had become more involved in Eleanor's life than he had expected. He had begun to admire her strength, her intelligence, and the way she handled everything with such grace. The cold, business-like walls she had built around herself were starting to crack, and Mark couldn't help but wonder if he was the one who could help her rediscover the warmth she had long ago abandoned. But for now, he kept his thoughts to himself. He had agreed to this arrangement, no questions asked. Yet, as time passed, he couldn't help but wonder if the line between duty and desire was starting to blur. And with that thought, Mark lay awake in the vast, empty bed that now belonged to him, feeling more uncertain than ever about what the future would hold. The weeks that followed felt like a slow, steady rhythm. Mark and Eleanor continued their lives as if they were simply coexisting, not really living. Every day was filled with business dinners, charity galas, and meetings that went on for hours. Eleanor's presence was a constant, her strength, poise, and power undeniable, yet there was something distant about her. It was as if the woman who had built an empire had forgotten how to live beyond her work. And Mark? He had begun to feel like a fixture in her life, there for appearances but never truly a part of her world. Yet, despite everything, there was an unspoken connection between them. Mark found himself drawn to Eleanor, not just for her wealth and influence, but for the complexity she hid behind that polished exterior. She was more than the businesswoman everyone saw at events and galas. She had a past, and Mark couldn't help but wonder about the woman beneath all the layers. But every time he thought he was getting closer to her, she would retreat back into the walls she had built around herself. It was during one of these charity events that things began to shift, though neither of them saw it coming. Mark was standing in the back of the grand ballroom, sipping on a drink and feeling out of place as usual. Eleanor was at the front, talking to a group of investors, her voice commanding attention, her every word calculated and perfect. She had a way of captivating everyone around her, and Mark couldn't help but notice how effortless it all seemed for her. But as he watched her from across the room, something caught his attention. A woman, who seemed to be in her late 20s, had approached Eleanor and was speaking to her with an intensity that immediately caught Mark's eye. The woman was dressed in an elegant red gown, her blonde hair perfectly styled. She was laughing, but there was something off about it, a kind of tension in the air that Mark could feel even from across the room. Eleanor was smiling, but Mark could see the strain in her eyes as she nodded along to the woman's words. Mark watched as the woman leaned in, whispering something in Eleanor's ear. He couldn't hear what was said, but he saw Eleanor's expression change, her smile faltering for just a moment. Then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the mask returned. Eleanor gave a polite nod and walked away, leaving the woman standing alone. It was then that Mark realized how much Eleanor was hiding. That brief moment of vulnerability, that crack in her carefully constructed persona, had revealed more than he had ever seen before. After the event, Mark found himself unable to shake the image of Eleanor's face as the woman spoke to her. He had never seen her like that, like a person who was fighting to keep it all together. He knew he had to know more. There had to be something deeper, something behind the walls Eleanor had built to protect herself. The following days were filled with the same routine, but Mark couldn't get that moment out of his mind. He began to pay closer attention to Eleanor, noticing the small signs of wear, the little cracks in her perfect facade. It was as if she had been playing a part for so long that she had forgotten who she really was. One evening, as they sat alone in the living room of the mansion, Mark decided to confront her. He had to know if she was willing to open up, if there was any chance of breaking down the walls she had built around herself. "Eleanor," he began, his voice soft but steady. "I saw something at the gala the other night. The way you looked when that woman spoke to you, you weren't just being polite. Something about that moment, it felt real. What's going on?" Eleanor stiffened, her eyes narrowing slightly as she looked at him. For a moment, there was silence, and Mark wondered if he had gone too far. But then, to his surprise, she spoke. "It's nothing, Mark," she replied, her tone guarded. "Just business. It's all part of the game." But Mark could see through her words. There was more to it, something that she wasn't ready to share. And for the first time, he realized just how much he wanted to know the real Eleanor, the woman behind the businesswoman, the woman who had been hiding in plain sight. The next few days were filled with an unusual tension. Eleanor became even more distant, and Mark couldn't help but feel that she was pulling away from him. Yet, despite the distance, he found himself more determined than ever to get closer to her. He wasn't sure what was driving him, whether it was the desire to understand the woman he had married, or something deeper that was beginning to grow between them. It wasn't long before the opportunity came. Eleanor had a private meeting scheduled one afternoon, and Mark, feeling a mixture of curiosity and apprehension, decided to follow her. He wasn't sure what he expected to find, but something inside him told him that this was the moment when everything could change. As he followed her to the meeting location, Mark's heart raced. He wasn't sure why he was doing this, why he felt the need to uncover the secrets Eleanor had kept hidden for so long. But as he stepped into the room behind her, he realized that this was the beginning of something new, something that would either bring them closer together or push them even further apart. And in that moment, Mark knew that whatever happened next, it would change everything. Mark stood in the doorway, his heart racing as he watched Eleanor enter the small, private office. The room was tucked away in a quiet corner of the mansion, far from the grand halls and the constant bustle of business. He had followed her here, driven by an urge to understand, to finally uncover the truth behind the woman he had married. He didn't know what he expected to find, but something inside him told him that this meeting was different. Eleanor had been distant, cold, and elusive for weeks, but now, she was here, alone in this space, about to face whatever secrets she had been hiding. As Eleanor closed the door behind her, Mark quietly stepped forward, careful not to make a sound. He stood just outside the office, his back pressed against the wall as he listened. At first, there was nothing but silence. Then, the faint sound of Eleanor's voice, smooth and calm, filled the air. She was speaking to someone on the phone, but Mark couldn't make out the words. He strained his ears, his mind racing with questions. Who was she talking to? And why did she seem so guarded? The conversation continued, though Mark could only catch snippets of it. He heard her mention business ventures, deals that needed to be secured, and something about a family legacy. But there was something in her tone, something that sounded off, like she was trying to conceal something more personal, something that didn't belong in the business world she so expertly navigated. Mark's curiosity got the better of him. He slowly moved closer to the door, his hand on the handle, ready to slip inside if she didn't notice him. But just as he was about to push the door open, Eleanor's voice stopped him in his tracks. "I can't keep doing this," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's not working. I thought I could handle it, but the pressure is too much. I never signed up for this, not like this." Mark's breath caught in his throat. Her words hung in the air, heavy with emotion, and for the first time, he realized just how much she had been carrying on her shoulders. This wasn't about business anymore. This was about something deeper, something far more personal. Eleanor wasn't just a businesswoman trying to protect her empire, she was someone who had been broken by the very world she had created. He stayed still, afraid that if he made a sound, she would stop talking. He had never heard her sound like this, vulnerable, almost fragile. For the first time, he saw her not as a powerful CEO, but as a person who was struggling to keep it all together. The walls she had built so carefully around herself were beginning to crumble, and Mark knew that he had to act, to finally bridge the gap between them. He opened the door slowly, quietly, and stepped inside. Eleanor turned sharply, startled by his presence. Her eyes widened, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. The air was thick with tension, the weight of the unspoken hanging between them. "Mark," she said, her voice low, a mixture of surprise and something else, something that Mark couldn't quite place. "What are you doing here?" He didn't know how to answer, didn't know what to say. All he could do was stare at her, the woman who had become both a stranger and a wife, someone he barely knew but couldn't stop thinking about. "I heard you," he said softly. "I heard what you said. About it not working. About the pressure." Eleanor's face hardened instantly, her defenses going back up. "It's none of your business, Mark." It is my business," he interrupted, his voice firm but gentle. "You're not alone in this, Eleanor. I may have agreed to this arrangement, but that doesn't mean I don't care. I want to understand. I want to help. You don't have to keep pretending everything is fine." There was a long pause, the silence between them deafening. Eleanor's eyes flickered with something, a mixture of fear and uncertainty, but she didn't say anything. Mark took a step closer, feeling a connection forming between them, something deeper than the contract that bound them. Maybe it was foolish, maybe it was naive, but he couldn't ignore the pull he felt toward her. He had to try, even if it meant risking everything. Eleanor finally spoke, her voice quieter now. I didn't want you to know. I didn't want anyone to know how much I'm struggling. I've spent my whole life building this empire, and I thought I could handle it. But now, she trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. Mark reached out, gently touching her arm. You don't have to do it alone, he said, his voice soft, sincere. I'm here. You don't have to hide from me. We can figure this out together. For the first time in a long while, Eleanor's guard seemed to lower. Her eyes softened, and she nodded, just once, as if acknowledging the truth of his words. It wasn't much, but it was enough. The silence between them shifted, no longer tense but filled with possibility. Mark knew that this was the turning point, the moment where everything could change. What started as a business arrangement was beginning to transform into something far more complex, something neither of them had expected. And as Eleanor took a step closer to him, Mark couldn't help but feel that, for the first time in their marriage, they were no longer just playing a part. They were beginning to be real with each other, in a way that neither of them had ever dared before. The following days passed in a quiet, almost surreal manner. Eleanor and Mark had crossed a line they never thought they would, moving from a purely transactional marriage to something more complicated, something real. As the days went by, Mark found himself becoming more and more involved in Eleanor's world, her fears, and the burdens she had been carrying for so long. He had always seen her as this powerful, unshakable businesswoman, but now, he was starting to see her as someone who was just as vulnerable as anyone else. One evening, after a particularly long day of meetings and phone calls, Eleanor invited Mark to join her for dinner. It wasn't part of the routine they had established. She usually ate alone or with business associates, but tonight, she wanted him there. Mark had a feeling that this dinner would be different. When he arrived, Eleanor was already seated at the long dining table, a glass of wine in hand, her expression more relaxed than he had seen it in weeks. I know this isn't exactly how we imagined things, she said as he sat down, her eyes meeting his with an unusual softness. But I have to admit, I'm grateful. For the first time in a long time, I don't feel like I'm carrying everything on my own. Mark smiled, a warmth spreading through him at her words. It was the first time she had acknowledged the shift in their relationship so openly, and it felt like a small victory, a sign that they were moving in the right direction. I'm glad you're starting to feel that way, Mark said, his voice steady. You don't have to carry it all alone. I'm here. We're in this together. There was a brief silence between them, the weight of their shared understanding settling over the table. For a moment, the mansion, the wealth, and the distance between them seemed to fade away, and all that remained was the connection they were building. As dinner continued, they talked about everything and nothing. Mark found himself laughing at Eleanor's dry humor, something he hadn't expected from a woman so focused on business. Eleanor, for the first time, seemed to let down her guard, sharing small anecdotes about her past, about her childhood, about her late husband, the man she had once been married to before everything became about business and empire building. Eleanor's voice softened as she spoke about him. He was a good man, Mark, she said, her fingers tracing the edge of her wine glass. But somewhere along the way, I lost myself. I started focusing on the company, the money, the power, and I forgot about everything else. I forgot what it meant to feel alive. Mark watched her, his heart heavy with empathy. He had always admired her strength, but now, as he listened to her, he realized how much she had sacrificed in the name of success. She had built an empire, but at what cost? I can't undo the past, Eleanor continued, her voice quiet, almost to herself. But I can try to make things right, try to find some balance. Mark reached across the table, placing his hand gently over hers. You don't have to do it all at once, he said softly. You've already made the first step by letting me in. And that means more than you know. Eleanor looked up at him, her eyes meeting his with an intensity that took him by surprise. For a brief moment, the world around them seemed to disappear, and all that mattered was the connection they shared in that instant. She pulled her hand back, but there was no distance in her eyes. Maybe you're right, she said, her voice steady again. Maybe it's time to stop living for everyone else and start living for myself. For us. The words hung in the air, and Mark felt a surge of hope. This was more than just a business deal, more than just a marriage of convenience. It was something real, something that could change everything. The evening ended quietly, both of them retreating to their separate corners of the mansion, but the shift had been made. Eleanor was no longer the cold, distant woman who had built an empire at the cost of her own happiness. She was someone who was starting to rediscover who she was, and Mark, unexpectedly, had become part of that journey. The next few days brought more subtle changes. Eleanor began to open up more, not just to Mark, but to herself. She was still the powerful businesswoman everyone saw, but she was allowing herself to feel more, to be more. She took the time to join Mark for breakfast, something they had never done before, and slowly, they began to carve out moments that were just for them, moments of quiet, shared understanding. For Mark, the transition was almost surreal. He had started this journey as a man desperate to get his life back on track, but now, he was finding something he hadn't expected: love. Real love. Not born out of obligation or convenience, but something genuine that had blossomed between them over time. He realized, as he sat beside Eleanor one morning, that this arrangement they had, this contract marriage, had turned into something entirely different. They were no longer just partners by agreement. They were becoming partners by choice. And for the first time in a long time, Mark felt a sense of peace. He wasn't sure where the future would take them, but one thing was certain: wasn't going anywhere. The days that followed were marked by a new sense of closeness between Eleanor and Mark. It was subtle, almost imperceptible at first, but it was there. Something shifted in their marriage. What had once been a business arrangement, a contract held together by necessity, was slowly evolving into something more genuine, more real. Mark could feel it, though he couldn't quite put it into words. Eleanor was different now, softer, more open in ways she had never been before. They still had their separate lives, Eleanor with her business, Mark with his law studies, but their paths began to cross in ways that felt natural. They shared breakfast in the mornings, something they had never done before. Eleanor had always been the type to work through her meals, too busy with her empire to focus on anything else. But now, she made time. For the first time in months, they sat together, talking about everything and nothing, finding comfort in each other's presence. One evening, as Mark was finishing up some work in his study, Eleanor entered the room, looking more relaxed than usual. She was dressed casually, her hair down, and she seemed less like the CEO of a multimillion-dollar corporation and more like a woman who had come home from a long day. It was a side of her Mark hadn't seen often, and it made him feel closer to her. "How's the work coming along?" Eleanor asked, leaning against the doorframe, a small smile playing on her lips. "It's coming," Mark replied, closing his laptop and pushing it aside. "But I think I'm finally getting the hang of this. I'm actually enjoying it more than I thought I would." She raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "You know, I never took you for the law type. What changed?" Mark smiled, his gaze softening as he looked at her. "I think it's because it feels like I'm doing something that matters. Helping people. Giving them a chance when they don't have one." Eleanor's smile faded slightly, her expression turning thoughtful. "I never thought about it that way," she said quietly. "I've spent my entire life building my empire, but I never really stopped to think about who I was helping. Or if I was helping anyone at all." There was a long pause as Mark watched her, wondering if she was finally starting to confront some of the feelings she had buried for so long. Eleanor was a woman who had built an empire, who had made sacrifices and fought hard to get to where she was. But in doing so, she had left something behind. And Mark realized, maybe for the first time, that she was starting to ask herself if it had all been worth it. He stood up slowly, walking over to her. "I think we're both figuring that out," he said gently. "But the important thing is that we're not doing it alone anymore. We're in this together." Eleanor looked up at him, her eyes meeting his with a mix of gratitude and something deeper, something more vulnerable. It was a look Mark had never seen before, and it made his heart race. I know, she said softly, and for the first time, I think I believe that. There was a moment of silence between them, the air charged with unspoken words. And then, before Mark could even process what was happening, Eleanor stepped forward and kissed him. It was soft at first, hesitant, as if she was testing the waters. But then, as Mark responded, it deepened, becoming more intense, more real. The kiss wasn't just a gesture, it was a promise, a silent understanding between them that things had changed. When they pulled away, both of them were breathless, their hearts pounding in their chests. Eleanor's eyes were wide, as if she had surprised herself. I don't know what came over me, she said, her voice shaky. Mark reached out, gently brushing a strand of hair from her face. It's okay, he said softly. You don't have to explain. I think I feel the same way. They stood there for a moment, simply looking at each other, the weight of the kiss lingering in the air. It was a moment of clarity, a realization that whatever had started as a contract between them had blossomed into something far deeper. The next morning, everything felt different. Eleanor was still the same strong, ambitious woman, but now there was a softness to her, a warmth that had been missing before. She looked at Mark with a new understanding, a new trust between them. And Mark, for his part, felt a sense of peace that he hadn't known he was searching for. As they went about their day, there was an unspoken agreement between them. They were no longer just playing roles. They were partners, not just in name but in heart. And for the first time since they had met, Mark felt that they were on the same path together. Eleanor still had her business empire to manage, and Mark still had his law career to build, but now, they knew they were in it for the long haul. They weren't just fulfilling a contract, they were building a future, a real one, together. And as Mark looked at Eleanor, standing by the window, gazing out at the world they were creating, he realized that no matter where their journey took them, they had already found what mattered most: each other. Weeks passed, and the changes between Eleanor and Mark continued to unfold. They found themselves not only sharing moments of quiet understanding but also actively supporting one another in ways they hadn't anticipated. For Eleanor, the walls she had built around herself were slowly crumbling. She began to confide in Mark, not just about her business struggles, but about her deepest fears: the fears of losing control, of sacrificing her personal life for success, and the loneliness that had crept into her life despite the wealth and power she had acquired. Mark, on the other hand, was learning more about the woman he had married than he could have ever imagined. He saw the vulnerability in her eyes when she spoke about her late husband and the pressures of being the head of a multimillion-dollar empire. And for the first time, he truly understood that Eleanor wasn't just a cold businesswoman. She was someone who had been carrying the weight of the world on her shoulders, trying to keep everything together while secretly yearning for something more. One afternoon, as they sat in the garden of their estate, Eleanor turned to Mark with a look of determination in her eyes. Mark, I've been thinking, she began, her voice steady. I've spent my whole life trying to control everything, to keep things from falling apart. But I think it's time to let go. To trust someone other than myself. Mark looked at her, his heart racing. He knew what she was saying, and the depth of her words hit him hard. It was a turning point for her decision to trust him, to allow someone else into her life, not just as a business partner but as a person who cared about her. Eleanor, I'm here, he said softly. I've always been here. You don't have to carry all of this on your own anymore. Her eyes softened, and she smiled, a genuine smile that reached her eyes. I know, Mark, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. And I think I've been afraid to admit it. But I want to be with you. Not because of the contract, not because of the business, but because of us. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The weight of her words hung in the air, and Mark realized just how much had changed between them. They were no longer playing roles. This was real, deeper than the business deal that had initially brought them together. Eleanor leaned back in her chair, her gaze fixed on the horizon. I've been hiding from myself for so long. But with you, I feel like I can finally start to be who I really am. I don't need to be the perfect CEO or the perfect wife. I just want to be me. Mark reached across the table, gently taking her hand in his. Then be you, Eleanor. That's all I want. Just you. They sat there for a while, letting the peace of the moment wash over them. The garden around them was quiet, the soft rustle of leaves the only sound in the still air. And in that moment, Mark knew that this was what they had both been searching for: peace, acceptance, and the beginning of something real. Later that evening, as they attended another high-profile event, Mark couldn't help but notice how different Eleanor seemed. She stood with more confidence, more at ease with herself. She was no longer the woman who hid behind her success and power. She was a woman who had found a new strength, one rooted not in control, but in vulnerability and trust. As they moved through the crowd, Mark caught a glimpse of Eleanor's eyes as she looked at him. There was a quiet understanding between them now, a bond that had formed over weeks of shared experiences and growing affection. And as the night drew to a close, Eleanor turned to Mark, her smile warm and genuine. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice full of meaning. "For being here. For being real." Mark smiled, his heart swelling with emotion. "I'm just glad we're doing this together." The future, once uncertain and full of doubt, now seemed full of possibility. They had started as strangers bound by a contract, but they had grown into something more, something neither of them could have predicted. And whatever came next, they would face it together, hand in hand. The days that followed were filled with a newfound sense of ease between Mark and Eleanor. They no longer tiptoed around each other, both uncertain of their place in the other's life. Now, there was no pretense. They had embraced their connection, and it had transformed everything. Mark was beginning to realize how much Eleanor had changed, how much she had let go of her need for control. In the past, she had built an empire on power and isolation, but now, she was opening up, allowing herself to be more than just the businesswoman everyone saw. She was a woman with emotions, desires, and, most importantly, vulnerabilities. One evening, as they sat together in the cozy living room, the soft glow of the fireplace casting dancing shadows across the room, Eleanor turned to Mark with an unusual look of determination. "Mark," she began, her voice steady but carrying an undercurrent of something deeper. "There's something I need to tell you. Something I've been holding back." Mark looked up from his book, his attention completely on her. "What is it, Eleanor?" he asked, sensing the shift in her tone. He put the book down, his heart beginning to race, unsure of what this moment would bring. She took a deep breath, as if preparing herself for what she was about to say. "I think I've been afraid," she said slowly, her voice low. "Afraid of really letting someone in. I've spent my whole life protecting myself, hiding behind my work, hiding behind my success. And I thought that was enough." Mark's heart thudded in his chest as he listened to her words. He could feel the weight of her admission, the vulnerability in her voice. This wasn't the Eleanor he had first met, the unshakable, no-nonsense CEO. This was the real Eleanor, the woman who had been scarred by years of self-imposed isolation. "You've never had to let anyone in," Mark said gently, his voice soft. "I understand that. But you don't have to do everything alone anymore. Not with me." Eleanor looked at him, her eyes filled with something that Mark couldn't quite name: hope, fear, and something else, something that made her seem more human than ever before. "I've been running from myself, Mark. From who I really am. But I want to stop. I want to stop hiding, stop pretending. I want to be with you, not because I need someone to fill the void, but because I've realized that I want you. I want to be with you, truly." Mark's breath caught in his throat. He had always known that Eleanor was more than just the woman she appeared to be, but hearing her say this, the words that had never been spoken before, filled him with a sense of warmth and relief that he had never imagined. "Eleanor," he said softly, reaching out to take her hand, "you don't have to be afraid anymore. I'm here. We're in this together. And I want you to, more than anything." For a moment, they simply sat there, the weight of their words settling between them like a gentle promise. Eleanor squeezed his hand, her heart feeling lighter than it had in years. She had spent so long building walls, so long convincing herself that she didn't need anyone, but now, she realized how wrong she had been. She did need someone, and that someone was sitting right in front of her. Mark smiled at her, his expression soft with affection. "We've come a long way," he said, his voice full of sincerity. "From strangers to partners, and now, we're something more. We're not just bound by a contract anymore. We're bound by something real." Eleanor nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Yes, we are," she whispered. "Something real." As the fire crackled in the background, Mark and Eleanor sat together, not just as husband and wife, but as two people who had truly found each other. And for the first time in a long while, Eleanor felt something she hadn't felt in years: peace. She wasn't alone anymore. And neither was Mark. They were on this journey together, ready to face whatever came next, knowing that they had each other. And as they sat in the quiet, the world outside seemed distant, as if it no longer mattered. All that mattered was the person sitting beside them, the person who had been there through it all, and the life they were about to build together. For the first time in their marriage, they were no longer just playing a role. They were real. They were truly together. As weeks passed, Mark and Eleanor's relationship deepened in ways neither of them had expected. What had begun as a business arrangement, a contract based on mutual necessity, had transformed into something truly meaningful. They were no longer just partners in name, bound by legal documents and financial agreements. They had become partners in life, learning to trust, to love, and to grow together. Mark found himself falling deeper for Eleanor with every passing day. He saw a side of her he never thought possibly: a woman who had spent so long building walls around herself, now willing to break them down and let him in. Her strength, once a shield against the world, had become a quiet vulnerability that he cherished. And for Eleanor, Mark had become more than just a man she had married out of obligation. He had become someone she couldn't imagine her life without. One afternoon, as they sat together in the study, the soft hum of the house around them, Eleanor looked at Mark with a smile that spoke volumes. "You know," she said, her voice full of warmth, "I never thought I'd find happiness in a marriage like this. I thought it would be nothing but business, nothing but a way to survive. But you've shown me something I didn't even know I needed." Mark smiled back at her, his heart full. "I think we've both surprised ourselves. I never imagined I'd end up here, with you. But I'm glad I did. You've changed my life in ways I can't even describe." Eleanor's eyes softened, her gaze steady. "I've learned so much from you, Mark. About trust, about love, about what it really means to live." Mark reached across the table, taking her hand in his. "And I've learned from you, Eleanor. About strength, about resilience. But most of all, about letting go. Letting go of fear, of control. And just being." The silence that followed was comfortable, filled with the understanding that had grown between them over the months. They no longer needed to speak to know what the other was feeling. They had built something real, something stronger than any contract. It was then that Eleanor spoke again, her voice quieter now, almost as if she were revealing a secret. "I want more than just this, Mark. I want to keep growing with you. I don't want to live in the past anymore. I want to build a future, our future." Mark's heart swelled at her words. "We will," he said, his voice firm with conviction. "Together, we'll build the life we've both been searching for." That evening, as they walked through the garden, hand in hand, the world seemed to stand still around them. They were no longer just two people bound by a contract. They were a couple, a team, ready to face whatever came next. And as the sun set on the horizon, casting a golden glow over the estate, Mark and Eleanor knew they had come full circle. The beginning of their journey had been built on necessity, but their future was built on something far stronger: love, trust, and the deep connection they had forged together. For the first time in their marriage, they were truly free. Free to be themselves, free to live without the weight of expectations, and free to embrace the life they were creating, side by side. With each step they took into the future, they knew one thing for certain: they had found something real, something lasting. And it was theirs to keep.